Today we are here with Professor Lee Jussim. He's a social psychologist, and we're going to talk about stereotype, accuracy, and bias. So usually when we hear the words stereotype and bias, we think about these as uniformly negative things, that stereotypes and biases are inaccuracies that should be avoided at all costs. So I teach in the College of Education here at East Carolina University, and I teach courses on diversity, and a lot of other colleges of ed have diversity courses. And Lee Jussim has done some work on how accurate or inaccurate stereotyping is. So we want to talk about that work with him. So before we start the interview, I want to introduce Dr. Jussim. So Lee Jussim is a professor of social psychology at Rutgers. He was a fellow and consulting scholar at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. He's published numerous articles, chapters, and edited several books on social perception, accuracy, self-fulfilling prophecies, and stereotypes. His most recent book, which I very much enjoyed, is called Social Perception and Social Reality: Why Accuracy Dominates Bias and Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. So Dr. Jussim, it's great to have you on the show today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for that great introduction.
Yeah, sure. So I want to start off with some quotes that you bring up in your recent book and in some blog posts that you've done about stereotypes. So here's a quote by psychologists Dale Miller and William Turnbull. And they say the term stereotype refers to those interpersonal beliefs and expectancies that are both widely shared and generally invalid. Some other social psychologists, John Darley and Russell Fazio, say that a great deal of the thrust of stereotyping research has been to demonstrate that these behavioral expectancies are overgeneralized and inaccurate predictors of actual behavior of the target individual. So here we have two quotes by pretty named psychologists, and there are other quotes in your book that frame the idea of stereotyping as something that is generally inaccurate and we should avoid when at all possible. Your research, though, has kind of challenged the idea that stereotypes are generally inaccurate. So can you briefly explain what's wrong with some of these quotes here?
On the definitional side, there are multiple problems, I think, with defining stereotypes as inaccurate. One is, if you do that, then you are required to first demonstrate that whatever belief about a group that's being studied, whether it's racial stereotypes or gender stereotypes or political stereotypes, national stereotypes, social class stereotypes, religion, anything, whatever stereotype that is under study, you would first need to get empirical evidence that those beliefs are inaccurate. Because absent evidence of inaccuracy, you can't assume that such beliefs that the beliefs that people hold are inaccurate. I mean, it's by your assumption, by the researcher's assumption, not by any data. And until recently, last 20, 30 years, there was almost no evidence no empirical evidence that bore on the question of whether people's beliefs about various cultural, demographic, ethnic, racial groups were accurate or not. So in the absence of evidence, scientists really don't have the scientific justification to assume that stereotypes are that any given stereotype is inaccurate. So if you define them as inaccurate, you end up being logically compelled, not in practice, but logically compelled to conclude there's no research on stereotypes.
Right. Yeah, and it sounds like a lot of your research was to not only look at work others have produced, but do your own work to find out, okay, this is an empirical claim, like you said. To say that the stereotypes are inaccurate is really an empirical claim. Are they actually inaccurate about the groups that they're about? It looks like some of your research has gone on to look at different beliefs that people have about groups and actually test, do they tend to be more accurate?
So once you can get past the idea that stereotypes are inherently inaccurate, it does exactly as you're saying, it becomes an empirical question. Well, what do the data say? If you compare people's beliefs about groups to strong criteria for what those groups are like. So for example, things like census data, or sometimes there are hundreds, even thousands of studies comparing various groups. So there are meta-analyses on for example, on the size and extent and patterning of gender differences in a wide variety of ways. So you can then compare people's beliefs that you've somehow assessed in some way to those criteria. And when that has been done, the striking result has been that people's beliefs about groups are often quite accurate. So they correspond well with criteria. So for example, in one of the earliest stereotype accuracy studies, people were asked to estimate the proportion of African Americans versus whites who had all sorts of characteristics, who were likely to have a high school diploma, who were likely to have been victimized by crime, who came from families with 5 or more children, and so forth and so on. And this is good census data on exactly these characteristics. And in fact, people's beliefs about African Americans versus whites was really quite, they weren't perfect. And neither I nor anyone else claims that I'm not sure there's ever been a single person identified whose stereotypes are perfectly accurate, but by conventional standards in social science, for example, the correlation between people's beliefs about groups and what those groups were like were really quite high. Depending on the study and the characteristics and the kind of the way it's done, those correlations range from about 0.5 to 0.8. So right. These are among the highest effects in all of social psychology. There are only a tiny handful of phenomena in social psychology that show the same sort of very strong relationship as shown between people's beliefs about groups and those groups' characteristics.
So I'm sure this is going to be, somewhat jarring to some of the people listening, because most of us have grown up with the idea that stereotype is a uniformly inaccurate thing that we should kind of avoid at all costs. So let's differentiate kind of what you're saying in this research from what you're not saying. So you're definitely demonstrating empirically that certain stereotypes that people hold about groups turn out to be correct, judged by census data and other stuff. So I guess the skeptic could say, okay, so is Dr. Jussim saying that all stereotyping is justified and that we should kind of have no problem with any kind of stereotyping at all?
Right. So that's actually another sort of rich and complex question. So let me make clear certain limitations to what I'm saying. So the accuracy issue is only even possible to consider for descriptive stereotypes. So I would distinguish between descriptive stereotypes about what people are like, versus prescriptive stereotypes, which are sort of moral injunctions about what people should be like. So children should be seen and not heard. A woman's place is in the home. Men should not walk around wearing dresses. These are prescriptive stereotypes, and these are just moral preferences that God knows how they arise, but they arise in a variety of ways. And it is inappropriate to discuss those as being either accurate or inaccurate, because essentially they're people's sort of beliefs about how the world should be. There's no accuracy standard for how the world should be.
So it's the difference between a statement of me saying, maybe descriptively, that on average more women are likely to stay home with the kids than men, and then we're saying that could be accurate or inaccurate. It's an empirical claim. On the other hand, there's a prescriptive stereotype of me saying, well, women's place is in the home. They should be home with
That's right. Yes, that's right. And it's the latter. Yeah, and there's good reason to believe that the latter, the prescriptive stereotypes, are more likely to cause problems, more likely to be unjustified. And you can see it from the nature of the prescriptive stereotypes. They're kind of telling people what they're supposed to do. And who are you or I to be telling any woman or any person how they should be living their lives? That's, in my view, that's completely unjustified and inappropriate. And that's probably much of what people are assuming is going on with stereotyping. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes that is going on with stereotyping. And when that's the case, that's clearly problematic.
So I guess when I think about stereotypes, I like to think about the distinction that psychologist Dan Kahneman made between what he calls fast thinking and slow thinking. So fast thinking is that kind of gut level, almost intuitive thinking we do when we don't have information to go on. So if I need to size a person up or something like that, I might resort to a very fast thinking approach, which looks an awful lot like what stereotypes often are. So then there's a slow thinking approach, which is the more slow, deliberate stuff that we do. When we have information to consider, we can consider it. I guess the thing about that Dan Kahneman doesn't do is he doesn't disparage fast thinking. He says it's often necessary because often we don't have information to go on. But he says what's wrong is when we are able to think slowly and consider information, and then we don't. That's when fast thinking becomes a detriment. So I often think about stereotypes that way. It seems like stereotypes are often an example of fast thinking that kind of get us to those situations when we can actually think more slowly and consider more things. So I don't know if that's kind of a good way to think about stereotypes.
Well, I mean, there's certainly an important point there, right? And that is, regardless of the existence of group differences on some characteristic, regardless of whether your beliefs about those differences are accurate, if you have an individual who does not conform to what the group is generally like, the individual should be judged on the individual's characteristics, not on some sort of generalization, no matter how valid, about the group. So in that sense, that's absolutely true.
Right, right. So you've done some research. In fact, one of the reasons I found out about your research was since I teach in a college of education, there's some research on kind of what we call self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is particularly important in education. So the reasoning tends to go that when teachers stereotype students, that they, in some ways, will create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if I have, let's say, an Asian male in a math class, and Asian males are great at math, so I'm going to, in some ways, treat the student as kind of capable of higher level math. The idea is, in some ways, I create a self-fulfilling prophecy because I treat the student in some ways better, so the student rises to the occasion, or vice versa. If I have a student, for some reason, I think is going to be incapable of something based on a stereotype, I create a self-fulfilling prophecy in a very negative sense that since I set low expectations, the student in some ways lives down to those expectations. Now, you've done some research that doesn't really question whether that happens, but questions the degree to which it happens and whether sometimes the reverse is also true.
Right. Well, so all of that is absolutely true. So teachers, there's now a lot of research on what real teachers in real classrooms actually do, how they perceive their students, the criteria on which they, how they arrive at those perceptions, and the extent to which teacher beliefs are typically self-fulfilling. And self-fulfilling prophecies do occur, but they tend to be quite modest in magnitude. They don't always occur. They probably don't occur at all, far more often than they occur. But they do occur to some degree. And one of the main reasons that they seem not to occur in general to a very large extent, is that teachers' judgments are accurate, that teachers are very good at recognizing bona fide differences in the prior achievement levels, performances, and motivations of students. I mean, those are all good predictors of student future achievement. So teachers' expectations tend to be really nicely in touch with reality most of the time. Now, that's not saying they're perfectly in touch with reality or never self-fulfilling. That is not true. That's going too far. Being pretty good is still a pretty substantial cry from being perfect. And so that means teachers' expectations are likely to be inaccurate to some degree, and those inaccuracies can and do sometimes produce self-fulfilling prophecies. But far more often, teacher expectations are much more strongly based on student prior achievement than they are causes of that future achievement.
Okay.
But both do occur.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I know that your work is descriptive. It's always in the realm of very descriptive social science. You're trying to figure out whether stereotypes are more accurate than not or whatnot. But what do you think would be the best takeaway, not only for future teachers, which is primarily my audience, but also for kind of the general public of your research? So why is it significant and important to kind of realize that stereotypes may actually turn out more accurate than not?
Right. So there are multiple issues here. The social sciences, and I include education in that, are often interested in adopting policies and practices that will make society a better place, will uplift low-achieving students, for example, will improve the quality of education for all students, will reduce social and economic inequalities society-wide. So those are all worthy and appropriate goals for social scientists. It's certainly appropriate for educators to want to be in the business of uplifting students, especially low-achieving students. So I'm on board with that all the way. But if the programs are based on inaccurate scientific beliefs that, if only we could change people's inaccurate stereotypes, then self-fulfilling prophecies will evaporate, teachers will treat students equally, and achievement differences will disappear. If that assumption is false, if the stereotypes are not that inaccurate in the first place, if teachers tend to develop pretty accurate perceptions of students, then programs that are based on changing teachers' inaccurate beliefs and inaccurate stereotypes are doomed pretty much to failure. I mean, they may not be complete failures, but their opportunities to make much difference are very, very limited. So to some extent, the issue is barking up the wrong tree. So that's one issue from a pure social problems, practical problem standpoint. One of the most interesting things to have emerged out of the teacher expectation literature, and this is not so much my work, but other people's work, is that one thing you might think about is how to harness positive teacher expectations, right? What is it that high expectation teachers are doing that lead the students for whom they have high expectations to achieve higher than they otherwise would have, right? That's a positive self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, a lot of what they're doing sort of boils down to sort of two dimensions of teacher practice. They're kind of warm and supportive, the warm fuzzy, they're not cold and harsh, but they also, at the same time, hold students to very high standards. They don't accept subpar work. Now, subpar is likely to be different for a student who comes in with a history of low achievement versus one with a history of high achievement. They are both probably not ready to tackle the exact same problem. That's where the accuracy stuff comes in as stuff to build on. So, to communicate to new teachers that their expectations for students are completely out to lunch and they should simply assume all students are identical walking in my view, is deeply dysfunctional because the students are not all identical walking in. And actually, most teachers know that.
Yeah, I think about particularly stereotyping. I mean, the issue of tracking educationally is a big one, and tracking is often potentially based on stereotypes, and that may create a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, but what you're saying is the solution is not to simply suggest all students must be equal, otherwise I'm stereotyping and stereotyping is bad. You need to maybe hold stereotypes very provisionally. So I think that this student may be coming from this kind of background, and this, I'll form an idea about this student, but I'm going to be open to revision. If the student can shows that they're potentially, that my stereotype is inaccurate, then I'll acknowledge that and I'll move on. But so maybe the idea is not to banish all stereotype, but maybe the idea is to hold stereotype in some way more wisely, more provisionally, something like that.
Absolutely. There's a cute example in my book where I was coaching a girls' soccer team, and we were getting ready for the playoffs. In the playoffs, a game that ended in a tie would be won with a shootout. And because these were little girls, there was no goal. So all they had to do was kick the ball in an open goal. Okay, so the coach's default was that the big, strong girls would be the ones most likely to do this. And what we did was we actually had essentially trials. We had all the girls line up and take a whole bunch of kicks. And we were mostly right. In general, the big, strong girls were generally more likely to get the ball in the goal. But there were two exceptions. We had like 10 girls on the team, but there were two exceptions. One of the big girls had a big, strong kick, but she had no control. So she was actually great in defense, because back in defense, she could just whale the ball and get it the hell out of our end, and she did the job there, but she couldn't hit the open goal. And then one of the little girls had this weak kick, but it was unbelievably accurate. And without a goalie in a shootout, that could win a game. And in fact, that's what actually happened. We ended up in one of the playoff rounds. We had a shootout. She was one of the ones who lined up, and she scored. So, I mean, what we're talking about is size stereotypes, and we're not talking about demographic stereotypes there. But we were mostly right. I mean, we got 8 out of the 10 girls right, but the 2 exceptions turned out to help us win a playoff game.
Sure. So the stereotype was mostly accurate, and then there were 2 exceptions.
Sensitive to the fact that it might not have always been right. Yeah.
So I guess my last question for you is, let me just play the skeptic, because I can imagine a skeptic of all this saying, okay, so let's say, Dr. Jussim, that all of this research is true, and on the whole, stereotypes turn out to be more accurate than not, and that maybe teachers even don't create as many self-fulfilling prophecies as the literature might want to suggest. Let's say all that's true. Don't we want to act as if the opposite is true, because we don't want teachers to be thinking that stereotyping is a comfortable thing to be in? So maybe someone's going to listen to this and take away the message, oh, okay, well then stereotyping is not really a problem at all, so I can just stereotype away. What would you say about that? I mean, is it best for us even acknowledge if your research is true to act as if it isn't?
Right, so there are multiple issues there. There is absolutely a risk of people hearing the message that, in general, stereotypes have a lot of accuracy, and treating that as essentially liberation to, not be sensitive to individual differences, and just to presume that any belief they hold about any group automatically and fully applies to every individual from the group. So there's a risk of that. And that would be a completely unjustified conclusion on the basis of the actual scholarship, even on stereotype accuracy. But there is but I agree with you, there is a risk of people misinterpreting it. And I do think that some of the resistance in the social sciences to accepting the message of the empirical literature is concern for exactly that kind of problem, that it would kind of lead people to essentially be socially, racially, culturally insensitive. And that would be a problem. So what is the solution to that? The solution to that is to talk about it and make it very clear that that is not the message of this research. At the same time, treating the conclusion as if it was completely untrue, that we should simply assume all groups and all people are exactly the same, that feels like a really strong, that feels like you are going to go down another wrong road. That feels like it's potentially extremely dysfunctional because of the sort of national and cultural and religious histories of different groups that, it seems to me an informed person in general is going to want to be informed and sensitive to and about those differences. And using that as part of essentially a benevolent attempt, at least in an educational context, to uplift students or to maximize students' opportunities to achieve and to learn, that seems to me far more likely to succeed than to simply do this blanket assumption that we're all exactly the same.
Sure. Great. Well, Dr. Jussim, it's been a really informative talk, and hopefully people watch this and think about the issue of stereotype, not only in a different way, but maybe a more nuanced way. It's not all good. It's not all bad. It's, some stereotype is accurate, some is inaccurate, some is benign, things like that. So I thank you for being on our program today.
Well, thank you for having me.